Welcome, everyone. Um, Jennifer Maxwell has her screen shared and she's going to start presenting.
So can everyone see the slides now?
I can see them.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm on dual monitors and using Zoom text, so that can be kind of tricky in Zoom occasionally. So welcome everybody and thank you for coming. I'm Jennifer Maxwell. I'm the Digital Accessibility Coordinator at the Community College of Denver. I work in the Teaching and Learning Center, and I'm presenting today because in addition to my job being accessibility, I am legally blind and I'm also a wheelchair user. So accessibility, both from a physical and visual standpoint, is very accessible, or is very important to me in my daily life and my work. So now I'll let Amanda say hello and then we'll carry on.
Yes, hello, everyone. And just so you know, Jennifer, we can also see your note slide. So I think is that what you had intended, or do we want to not have the note accessed?
I think I'll share the
Okay, yeah, I think that would be good in case someone just wants the notes.
yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So hello, everyone. My name is Amanda O'Sullivan. I am an English instructor at Community College of Denver. I have been at CCD for 5 years, and I am part of the Inclusive Excellence Leadership Team. And basically, the point of this presentation is going to talk a little bit about the work that myself and Jennifer have done. As part of the Inclusive Excellence Leadership Team, we've been working on a professional development series to promote equity for faculty and staff, administration. And so when we were creating this training, we had brought in our experts through TLC and asked, kind of like for a little bit of advice and almost like an internal audit, what could we do better? And part of the feedback that we got was that their own experience at the TLC and trainings that they were creating, when they were creating an equitable training, it came to be that some of the materials that they were using were not accessible. And so they wanted to kind of warn us and say, if you're going to have an equitable training, you should make sure that this is inclusive for everyone. And so that's kind of where mine and Jennifer's kind of collaboration started. Jennifer is our expert on technology and accessibility, and she has guided me and mentored me in helping make the IELT's professional development course accessible so that it is inclusive to everyone. And it's accessible in this case in terms of, vision. So for example, if a person is blind and they're not able to read the materials, having a screen reader read that information. So that is kind of like an overview of what we're going to cover today. Jennifer is our expert and I am her case example of what I had experienced and then how Jennifer has helped us resolve this issue so that we have become more equitable.
Thanks, Amanda. And then I just wanted to review our learning outcomes for today that I hope you will walk away with. And definitely if you have more questions, as I know 45 minutes is not a lot of time to delve into this. So basically I want people to be able to understand and describe the experiences that marginalized identities how they're often excluded in equity work. And then we're gonna talk about also how you can identify easily materials that are accessible and are not accessible, because what happens a lot of times is I've been through equity trainings that are very narrowly focused to race or to gender or some other identity, which is extremely important, but as someone who is visually impaired, I can oftentimes say that I've not been able to fully engage in those trainings because they're not inclusively designed for everyone. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then getting into the more technical aspects, we'll talk about in D2L, a way that you can make things more easily accessible. And then we'll talk about some ways and some tools that you can use to create and curate activities that are accessible both in this virtual sphere that we're in right now, and as we get back to the physical world, how you can make those interactions more accessible. So let me get past this. All right, Amanda.
Okay, so before we get started, kind of looking into our case example of how we were able to make our training session more equitable, we want to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same page in terms of understanding what equity is. Through a lot of the work that I have been doing, I have quickly realized that everyone is coming into this equity work at different places and different levels. Some people have years and years and years of experience, and some people are kind of a little bit more new to this. So for us, we thought it was important to take a moment to actually talk about the difference between equality and equity. So many of you have probably seen some of these memes on Facebook that show, 3 or 4 children looking over a fence at a ballpark. But, the same idea is in this cartoon that we're presenting here, but we just thought it was a little bit more applicable to the point that we're trying to make in terms of equity being for everyone, and realizing more, kind of understanding a little bit more about intersectionality and how there are a lot of barriers that prevent some people from being as successful, and there's also a lot of privilege that people have, and we'll talk about intersections on the next slide, but we wanted to take a moment to look at this cartoon. Oh, sorry, Jennifer, if you don't mind just going back so I can
no worries.
Read it for everyone. So just a little quick description. We have an image with a teacher of sorts sitting at a desk, kind of far away from his students. And across the desk, we have a number of animals. We have a bird, a monkey, a penguin, an elephant, a goldfish, a seal, and a dog. Behind those animals is a large tree. And the teacher is saying, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So we wanted to use this to kind of open up the discussion a little bit more, to kind of hear from all of you what you're seeing when you look at this cartoon. What is it saying to you? And what does that have to do about, understanding the differences between equality and equity? So if someone wants to take themselves off mute, which I think is possible, is that correct, Warren? People can unmute themselves?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So if someone would like to unmute themselves and just, share what your thoughts are in terms of this cartoon.
This is Emily Lytle. I would say that the differences for equality is judging everybody by the same their ability, their achievement on the same outcome, whereas equity is acknowledging that people need different resources to accomplish that outcome.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Hi, this is Dawn Stratton. I'm a testing center director. I agree with what Emily just said, but I also, because I'm a testing center director, it also excludes how to demonstrate subject mastery, right? So equality and equity differs in that way because you might be great at drawing a poster, but terrible at public speaking, but you both could be used to demonstrate a particular thing potentially, right? So it's using how do we measure anything in education, how we teach it and then how we measure it. And right now teaching is being told they have to teach in a certain way for measures that don't necessarily benefit the student. So, you're starting with in a deficit already.
Right. It reminds me of the keynote speaker who was saying, it's not so much about what you're teaching, it's how you're teaching it, right? To meet those different needs. I'm going to read out some comments that we have in the chat. So it says TW, so those sound like initials. The educational field is not level for everyone. And I think that is a really important thing to consider. And, again, this experience that we'll be talking about was about a professional development series that was for students, but it was also for staff and faculty and things like that. But it is really important for you to always kind of have that in the back of your mind, whether it's for students or colleagues or peers, that not everyone is coming to the table. Not everyone is coming into your classroom. Not everyone is coming into your work environment with the same backgrounds, right? And so we, as a college system, want to try to make things as fair as possible. And that's not just about being equal and giving everyone the same test. It is about providing those tools to help everyone be successful and understanding how the background that people are coming into the environment with. So yeah, great point. Thank you, TW. One other comment that we have in the chat from Alvina says, I really enjoy this cartoon. It means we shouldn't all be measured the same. Education should help us explore our talents and strengths instead of a one size fits all, AKA standardized testing. Right. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. That's a wonderful point. Thank you, Alvina. Okay. Does anyone else want to share out anything else that they have observed from this particular cartoon?
I think the only other thing I would point out, this is Dawn, that education usually is being engaged in for a particular reason. We can't forget the reason, right? So is it for self-improvement? Is it to get a job? Is it to meet certain industry standards? So even having these conversations, I'm not seeing many people here from like workforce readiness. They may be here. I haven't looked at everybody, but it's in the last session we went to, you don't talk about anybody without them being there, right? So having these conversations with all the stakeholders are really key to building this equity.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to kind of pay attention to is just literally asking some questions. And I know I'm a teacher, and so these are kind of the questions that I would ask myself. But, looking, okay, is this fish ever going to be able to climb that tree, right? No matter what we do, right? Is the seal going to climb that tree? So again, it's not so much about what we want to teach students all the time. Yes, there are learning outcomes that we need to meet, but it's how we're teaching that content or finding other solutions, other content that's related, so that everyone can have a chance to, even if they're not climbing that tree, but to be successful in an outcome. So I think that's a really important point too. And then obviously looking at those who would be more successful already at that, at climbing that tree. It looks like we have a couple of more comments in the chat that I'll read out. So Kyle Keller says, quote, it's a quote from Einstein, quote, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." And that's attributed to Einstein. And I think that's a really wonderful quote. And I think a lot of that kind of speaks to how people might perceive themselves and have that limited level of confidence just because of how they have been treated or, past experiences. So finding ways to lift everyone up. And Emily Little says, yes, I was just thinking that. And then Ruth Ann Oruela says, I'd also say that there seems to be an accommodation made for the goldfish. But just because there's an accommodation to access the content doesn't mean that assessments are measuring what they are learning. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I guess maybe is it that the goldfish is being accommodated because it's on a tree, I guess that would be like a tree stump or something like that. I didn't notice that. So that's a great observation, Ruth Ann.
All right. So are we ready to move on?
There's actually a couple more comments that I'll just read just to make sure everyone is heard. Karen Navell said, is climbing the tree indicative of what we really need them to do, or is it a false test? That's a great question or great point. Sasha Nelson said, Director of Workforce Education. Oh, I just lost it there because we got a new one coming in. Thank you for honoring workforce and spot on. The blind spot is academia. We don't see all the trees. Alicia says they each have their own strength and can be successful in different settings. Yes, I love that. Mark Whitler, where does the end goal fit? If the goal is to be able to climb a tree, shouldn't that be considered and recognized? Not all are capable. How should that be addressed? And then Beth Almanza, sorry, I know Jennifer, you're eager to get to the next one. Let me just read out this final comment. I have found that allowing the students to work in smaller groups help them to be more confident and help one another no matter their limitations. Yeah, I love that. Allowing students to teach other students, I think, is a really great tool as well. Okay, so it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page here in terms of equality and equity. So Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and move on? Well, the next slide is kind of asking those questions so we can kind of move forward from there.
Yeah. So, like she said, we covered a lot of this. And then just thinking about also, what should we consider when we want to work from an equity lens? And I think you all answered that question already a lot in the chat as far as, planning your activities versus your assessments, how the accommodations play into that, and one thing we'll talk about later in our presentation is where universal design comes into that as well. I have some great resources on that. And then Amanda, if you want to talk about this figure a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So again, we're just kind of building vocabulary here, making sure everyone is kind of coming into this with the same terms before we get into our case example. But we thought it was also important to talk about intersectionality and just kind of bring that to light, that when we're talking about equity, we need to make sure that we're understanding that everyone who we are encountering is going to come from different, have these different identities, right? And rather than just looking at things and saying, okay, let's look at this from a gender lens, or let's look at this from a race lens, or let's look at this from a disability or ability lens. Rather than seeing those as singular identities, really thinking about as humans, we oftentimes don't just have one of those identities. We have a combination of identities. And when those identities intersect, they can create either privilege or more barriers, or discrimination, or less opportunities, or fewer opportunities. So I like this particular image talking about intersectionality, even though it doesn't really give us the intersection that I like to visually see, because it talks about some possibilities in terms of identity, but also it has those thumbprints or fingerprints at the end. So that's going to kind of indicate that this person in the middle identifies in terms of, some aspect of religion, class, and ability or disability. So again, that could, based on the individual, we don't know the background, but these are things that we want to understand. So if you have, someone who you're working with who is blind, for example, but then also is, let's say, Latino, we would want to make sure that we're not looking at those things as separate identities. We want to look at those things as having an intersection and take that into consideration, especially when we're designing our courses. And I know that that can sound really overwhelming. Think about this thing, religion and culture and class and gender. And we're not aiming for perfection here. It's more about just having these things on your radar and practicing as much as you can to be as inclusive as possible, and just having that awareness that, again, people coming into your training session, people coming into your classroom, whatever your workplace, whatever the scenario is, they will have different forms of identity that are not going to be exactly the same as your own, and trying to, think about those identities and be a little bit more preventive, before a problem occurs, like someone not being able to get access to your course materials, for example, will save you a little bit of a headache. Just being a little bit more preventive and, thinking about those things as you're planning, in the planning stage rather than the aftermath. Okay.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add to that, just from my own experience, everyone, is, as I mentioned in the introduction, I have a few different intersecting identities in that I'm a woman with a disability, but I also recognize that like Amanda was saying, I have privilege in that I am a white woman with a disability. And unfortunately, I've seen in the years of disability services that I've done that people of color that also have disabilities have had disadvantages that I never faced growing up in K through 12. So, I fully understand and acknowledge that, yes, I have my identities that impact my life, but also recognize that there's privilege there just by being white.
Mhm.
So again, in terms of identity, like I said, Amanda covered these pretty well. We just wanted to, again, have visual and a mix of text to help diverse learners. So having, your constituents recognizing that they all come from different lenses, different perspectives. And again, as I said earlier, being aware that just because you're doing a training on race doesn't mean that you don't have people with disabilities attending that training, and would like to be able to fully engage. And like I was saying, some barriers become more salient depending on the situation. If I'm in a building that doesn't have a ramp for a training, then in that moment, my physical disability has become much more impactful than, say, my gender or my visual impairment. And again, like any good practice, putting yourself in another person's shoes or perspective, thinking about, okay, how would this work if someone who were using a wheelchair needed to engage in this activity. And then again, just thinking about what barriers do they face. And so this is where we kind of want to open it up to you, the audience, as well, in terms of identity and challenges and intersectionality that you've seen or maybe experienced that you'd like to share via live video or in the chat. So I'll let the people that want to speak freely first, and then if Amanda or Warren could read the chat, that'd be awesome.
Yes, and I'll just add on, I forgot to mention also that, you know, a lot of, some of these identities are more visible and present than others, and some are kind of more hidden. So again, you know, we're not expected to be mind readers, but again, that awareness that some identities are visibly presented, that we can actually see if a student is coming into my classroom in a wheelchair. And so then obviously you would be able to make an adjustment if that wasn't already, you know, in place. But, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have realized in this online environment, you know, there are some students who I've never actually seen a face. And everything that you have is just, you know, based off of, you know, whatever you can get from that student. And so it's almost kind of become even more impacted because of the environment that we're all kind of currently working in. So again, just being aware of that a lot of times, especially in this online world, a lot of identities have become invisible. And in a lot of ways, things and barriers have become even more visible, right? So just be aware of that, that concept as well. Okay, so as Jennifer said, would anyone like to share some barriers that I know everyone is coming from different areas across the different colleges. Some of you are instructors or teachers, and some of you are kind of more working with colleagues and staff, administration. So can anyone think of any examples or anything that has occurred in your environment where there were some barriers that were presented?
Yes, I can add. I do have a question. When it comes to, and my name is David Squads, I'm from Pueblo Community College. I am interested in statistics with once an individual is made to feel excluded, regardless of the activity, whether it be class or training, what is the level of success once that individual has felt that exclusion?
That's an amazing question. I don't have any data on that. I don't know if you do, Jennifer, but it's certainly something we all should look into. You know, once we have lost a student or we've lost a colleague because that person was feeling excluded, you know, like lost meaning, you know, lost interest or engagement, what are the chances of getting that student to completion or to get that level of success? I personally don't have an answer. I don't know if anyone else does, but it's an amazing question.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, I don't have any data per se, but I mean that's the crux of why I decided to do this presentation, is because I've been to numerous equity trainings, you know, where it's on very interesting, very good topics about race, gender, LGBTQ status, things like that. And even equity in aggregate, I've been in trainings where accessibility for disabilities has been, I want to say ignored, but not intentionally. It's just not something that people think about. And to your question of what's the impact of that, I would say that it can be very frustrating and disheartening to go to a training and realize, oh, this PowerPoint is completely inaccessible to me, or they're having me, and as we'll see later, they're having me do an activity that I can't participate in because the room is not set up for it. So it can be very disheartening, but I will say at the same time, I have been in trainings that are face-to-face where things are not fully accessible, but then the presenters have been willing to acknowledge that on the fly and own it and then make adjustments. So even though things might still be glitchy, that ownership, I think, is really important to me of getting back on track. And in terms of a class, you know, working with that student up front to say, you know, this is the letter of the law in your accommodations, but let's have a conversation about whether your needs kind of thing up front. And that would be my recommendation.
Hi there. my
Anybody
name is
else have
Andy.
comments or questions on this area, or feel more comfortable posting to the chat?
I like that, Jennifer, you mentioned the white privilege thing, and I have children that are Hispanic, and I have dealt with both. So I'm a white woman and my children are Hispanic, and my son and my daughter have had a very different educational experience than I did. So my son actually ended up dropping out of high school because of the treatment and because of the disengagement from the educational system with the Hispanic students. So I think that it's very important that we understand that a lot of people come into, or a lot of our students come into the classroom with a general distrust of us sometimes as they've gone through some educational type of barriers with people that are not like themselves. And so I think that this is a great way for us to try to identify what we need to do to better understand people, not just of different races and ethnicities, but also people with disabilities. And I'm also, there are some things that people don't think of, like I'm a radiology professor, PCC, Pueblo Community College, and the men that are in our programs, and I've said this in a different breakout session, they have, we have to be really careful about how the men are educated because of how they have to engage with female patients. And so that can be kind of a difficult and sensitive subject. So it's not just race, but it can also be gender related. And so we have to learn how to be a little bit sensitive about all of that, all inclusive. And some of these things they don't jump out at us like that.
Great point. Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, I keep those comments coming, and we will talk about them at the end for sure. But I did want to move on to our case in point of all of this. And again, I could throw multiple examples of you, but this is probably the most recent that I've encountered. So Amanda, if you want to talk about the IELT training and sort of set us up, and then I'll talk about the solution.
Okay, great. Thank you. So again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but I am a member of the Inclusive Excellence Leadership Team. And part of one of the goals that we had was to create a professional development opportunity for not just staff, or not just faculty or not just students, but something that was immersive and something that included everyone. And we found this really great curriculum. It's an open resource if anyone is looking for anything, and we're happy to share anything that we have developed or found. But we found this training series from Move to End Violence, and it's called Racial Equity and Liberation. And it's just been a really great professional development that our team has done and that we're actually currently offering at CCD. And when we were doing it, we had been so focused on the content of the development series, and it's very much focused on race and racial equity, right? And so when we were creating it, found the PDFs from this open resource, and we posted it on our D2L shell. In the training that I've had before, I kind of always thought that PDFs were a really great, very accessible form of technology. However, like I said, we also wanted to get the TLC, the Teaching Learning Center, to come in and kind of give us some advice and let us know how we were doing and sort of give us a little quick audit of the work that we had provided. And the TLC at that point had mentioned that it would be really important for our group, since we're focused so much on inclusion, and we're talking about equity for everyone, for us to make sure that the materials that we were presenting were actually accessible to everyone. So that's kind of what we had. We had this PDF, and it's beautiful. This is the example right here. It has this wonderful art, and it looks very aesthetically pleasing. We have this beautiful drawing here that kind of represents intersections. But when Jennifer went to check to see if this was accessible by a screen reader, it wasn't. So what she calls, she would say it's not tagged. And so this wouldn't get picked up. And so again, that's going to exclude, a group of people, and that's not what we want. Other things is it's not prioritizing information for that screen reader. I'm not going to get into the weeds because to be honest, Jennifer's going to help us with that. She's our expert. But a person who is blind is not going to be able to see this image. So we need to do what we can so that anyone who is blind or even has, some level of blindness, they would be able to access this information and have a similar experience in terms of hearing about the image, hearing about the picture, if they weren't able to see it for themselves. And so this is our problem. And then Jennifer is going to show us what we can do to solve this. And it didn't take too much time, and it looks pretty similar. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jennifer.
All right, yeah, thank you. And a good introduction. So what I have here now is just one solution. So I want to preface this and say that if you have access to Adobe Pro at your institution, then you can create accessible PDFs that are tagged and that have proper reading order and headings and image descriptions. But I recognize that not everyone has access to that tool, right? Or the time or the background knowledge to really get into the weeds on it. So what we came up with for our training was to take this inaccessible PDF and then put it in the D2L accessible templates that, if we have time, I'll be happy to show you how we did that, where we got them. But just to give you a preview here of, this is the screenshot of basically the same information with the same images, headings, layout. But the difference is that this is completely accessible to someone using any kind of screen reader, whether they're blind, low vision, or they have a learning disability, they're English language learners, because that's also an important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind is that when we talk about accessibility, it's not just for blindness, it's also for anybody using text to speech, i.e. having these words read aloud by the computer. So this was our solution, and like I said, if we have time, I'll be happy to share it, but I do definitely have some links for you all to get to those templates. So that was our problem. This was our solution. So any questions or comments at this point?
I'll say, just as somebody who's an epileptic, and has had multiple grand mal seizures, while doing regular stuff in life. That's one that often gets forgotten about, that as somebody who's an African American male and a epileptic can compare and contrast how much the two are talked about, and there's a clear distinction, right? So I think keeping all disabilities in mind is something that'll be helpful moving forward for instructors, because I can say that as an instructor, so yeah, just a remark I wanted to make.
Yeah, definitely a good point. Thank you. Has anyone encountered this? Has anyone used PDF and then converted them to other formats, things like that?
Oh, and Jennifer, we have a comment from Mark Whitler. Jennifer, could you include the resource in a transcript?
Yes, we will do that. And I also do have it on a slide that we'll be sharing out.
Yes. And then Emily Little says, I'm thinking about my friend with an invisible disability and the struggle she has every day with the side comments or lack of accommodation. Because I know her, I know to think about these things, but people who do not know about invisible nature of disability may not think about it. So yeah, that's a great point. And
yeah, definitely.
And then those of you who might be a little bit concerned about copyright or anything like that. So this was an open resource where we were given, on the website, it said that we had access to use this material, but you couldn't recreate it. So then I just simply reached out to Move to End Violence, and they were more than willing to allow us. We weren't changing any of the information. We were just making it more accessible. So sometimes it's just as simple as, shooting an email and just getting that okay. Can we, just not change the content, but we're just going to format it in a different way. And especially people who are talking about equity work, they're going to definitely want to spread the word and make this as accessible to as many people as possible. So, that's always something that you can do as well.
Yeah, and I see we're down to our last few minutes. So in terms of sharing some resources, I think we did cover some of the design impacts and some things that you can do. But I just wanted to real quickly bring up some other barriers that I've encountered or heard from others that they have encountered. So things like, again, can someone using a wheelchair navigate to all of your stations in the room? A lot of times we want our teaching to be very kinesthetic, very engaging, but if the room is small, can someone navigate it? And then, thinking of the hidden disabilities that everyone is bringing up, can someone who's colorblind participate in a sorting activity, or for that matter, even read your slides? And then again, being inclusive with your language. One of my big pet peeves is when people refer to me as wheelchair bound. I'm not bound by my wheelchair. It's liberating for me. It's a technology that gives me greater access to the world. And then Amanda, did you want to talk about the deficit language or asset?
Yeah, it looks like there's a typo on there. Sorry, it's supposed
Okay.
to be an I, not an O.
Okay, I was like, yeah.
Right, but again, just making sure that we're being thoughtful about the language that we're using in the content when we're designing the material. Are we thinking about using the correct terminology as much as possible, not seeing these barriers as a deficit, but seeing them as an asset. And then the final one, I'm just going to kind of move quickly because it's 12 o'clock, but again, thinking about, non-native speakers and using, references that are only kind of affiliated with a particular culture or group, rather than using examples that would be kind of like a broader, more global, example or, expression. So those are things that you can just kind of have on your radar as you're designing these courses.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
And then like I said, being mindful of time, these are sort of our takeaways, which I think we're in some cases here, we're already preaching to the choir. A lot of you understand these things. And then finally, I did want to, because many of you have been asking for it, I will also paste these resources into the chat, but we in the TLC have a website where you can go and find out more about accessibility in Word and PDF, things like that. And then we also have a link here to the D2L documentation on how to download and set up the accessible templates. And then lastly, I put in a link for accessible learning in higher education from CAST, the Center for Applied Special Technology. They do a lot with universal design and neuroscience and varied learning and things like that. So they have some great resources and guides and their own webinars in here. So definitely I'll post those in the chat for you guys. Or if Amanda, if you want to do that, since we're short on time.
I can do that.
So, but yeah, so since we are about to break for lunch, are there any final thoughts, questions that people have before we wrap up here? Is there anything coming up in the chat?
I don't see anything else but many, many, many thanks for the presentation. Everyone is expressing how great and wonderful the presentation was.
Oh, good. Thank you, Warren. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Enjoy the last couple of sessions and have a great rest of your day and great weekend.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. And I'll just, if you are really interested and you don't want to wait for the PowerPoint, I'll